Hi, everyone. Thanks for filing in. I'm going to give it just about a minute so everyone can log on, and then I'll get started with our introductions. All right, so it looks like the number of attendees has kind of leveled out, so I'll get started. So welcome to the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference. Thank you for coming to John Leshy's keynote address. My name is Lisa Milstein, and I'm a conference co-director of PUC this year. I'm going to introduce the keynote real quick, and then the esteemed Dean Burke is going to be introducing John Leshy before he gives his talk. So just a quick tech warning: if you can't see yourself or hear yourself or see any video or audio options, that's because in a Zoom webinar you don't have the option to turn that on. So don't worry about that. No one's going to be able to see or hear you. However, we do have a Q&A function enabled if you'd like to ask any questions of Mr. Leshy, and we will have about 15 minutes at the end to answer those questions. So feel free to throw questions in the chat throughout the speech as they come up. Also, our alumni board, Friends of Land, Air, Water, who helps to provide stipends for students doing unpaid public interest environmental law internships, is going to be, the link is going to be put in the chat so that people can donate if they'd like to support law students doing public interest work. And lastly, I'd like to note that the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Lehy, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following the treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the coastal reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions to their communities at the University of Oregon and the land we now refer to as the state of Oregon. PUC would like to acknowledge the traditional homelands of the Kalapuya people in the Willamette Valley and express our respect for the tribal nations of Oregon. Thank you, and now the esteemed Dean Burke will introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Lisa, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Professor John Leshy to all of you. I am going to tell you a story about him as opposed to listing his many accolades. But don't worry, John, it's a good story. So I met Professor Leshy early in my career as an academic at the Natural Resources Law Teachers Institute. And he was a giant to me as one of the authors of the case book that I was using to teach federal natural resources law. And I will admit that I was a bit intimidated by him. And I certainly didn't think he'd have any interest in talking with me. But then there was a field trip. One of the best things about being an environmental and natural resources law professor is that all of our conferences, they always include a field trip. And so on one of those field trips, I sat next to Professor Leshy on the bus. And any intimidation factor melted away. And what remained was great respect and admiration. Now fast forward to 2008, he's on the transition team for the Obama administration for the US Department of the Interior, and he sent me an email. And it basically said, don't read too much into this because no one has asked me for a recommendation yet. But would you be interested in joining the administration at the Department of the Interior? And I replied that I was just thrilled to be on his list. And of course, I wanted to be considered for a position in the administration. As many of you know, I went on to become the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Land Management and then the Acting Assistant Secretary for Land and Minerals, overseeing the BLM and 3 other bureaus. So why am I telling you this story, you may be wondering? And I'm telling you the story to make 3 points. First, your idols are just people. Step up and meet them. They may be jerks, but they may not be, but they're just people, and you just never know where that encounter will lead. Second, as much as I'm grateful for this technology that we're using today, and will continue to use it in the future, being in person makes a difference. Sitting next to him on a bus made a difference. And then the third thing is we often talk about mentors in our life, and he has certainly given me advice. We also need sponsors in our life. And in this case, he was my sponsor. He leveraged his influence to help the administration and to help me. So along with all of those accolades, John Leshy is a giving person, and I am grateful for all that he has done in the profession and all that he has done for me. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor John Leshy.
Thank you very much, Dean Burke. I'm very touched by that story. I remember it. I remember the email I sent you actually pretty well. And wow, who knows what it led to all these years later. So I'm really, really touched and delighted to be able to participate in this conference and to enjoy your introduction. This conference is legendary, as you all know, and I'm really delighted to be able to participate. You know, I wrote a book about public lands that I'm going to talk about today. It was a mere coincidence that my book was released earlier this week, actually, on the 150th anniversary of Yellowstone National Park. That event, of course, was an important event in public land history. And while the national parks are the most well-known, I want to emphasize that my book deals with all of the public lands. Slide, please, Lisa. I've got a map here that will show all of the public lands, which includes those managed by the, next slide. That's the book cover, and that's a piece of public lands. Yes, this slide. You can see the extent of the public lands here. Most people know something about them. My book is about all of these lands managed by all of the 4 major public land agencies that you see listed on the map. Those managed by the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Land Management, as well as the Park Service. My book is the first comprehensive history of all of these lands in a very long time, many decades. Most people know something about these lands, sometimes when controversies make headlines, as when a few years ago, President Trump drastically downsized 2 large national monuments in southeastern Utah. The Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase, and later persuaded Congress to open up the Arctic Refuge in northeastern Alaska to oil and gas leasing. But what's not well known about the public lands is their breadth. The United States owns more than 600 million acres of public forests, plains, mountains, wetlands, deserts, shorelines, almost 1/3 of the land in the country, an area nearly 10 times the size of Oregon. They're open to all, and they're managed primarily for conservation, recreation, and education. To my way of thinking, they're one of America's great institutions. Their reach surprises many because, you know, our culture in America has always celebrated private property and distrusted government, particularly the national government. Indeed, when, you know, I talk about these public lands and show a map like this, the usual response is, gee, I had no idea. How did this happen? I wrote the book to answer that question. Of course, it didn't just happen. It came about because of a long series of decisions made by our representatives in our government, the political decisions. What those decisions were and how they came to be made are the core of my book. Close slide, please. The core of my book's story begins around 1890 because it was then that Congress began making the most significant political decisions to hold on to and safeguard the public lands, mostly for broad conservation purposes. Now, this was after, usually long after, the United States acquired title to these lands in the first place from Native Americans and from foreign governments. Acquisition from Native Americans obviously began with the invasion of settlers from Europe long before the United States even existed. And then the US government, once it was established, continued that process and proceeded to acquire vast areas from foreign governments as well through deals like the purchase of the Louisiana Territory and from the French and the purchase of the Alaska Territory from the Russians. Native Americans lost title to these lands through a sequence of events that usually began when they were dispossessed through duress, chicanery, sometimes violence, by an evolving cast of characters: trappers, miners, speculators, squatters, various kinds of developers, often backed by the military force of the European nations and their successor, the United States. Acquisition of formal title usually came through arrangements that, while providing natives some compensation, would never make up fully for the injustices perpetuated or the enormity of their loss. I don't address the acquisition of title from indigenous peoples and from foreign governments in any detail in my book. That process was generally completed well before the US decided to hold on to significant amounts of land. And it has also been the subject of a number of good books. In the latter part of my book, I do discuss in some detail efforts by tribes in the modern era to gain greater influence over public lands to which they have ancestral ties, efforts that have had considerable success. Now, what I'm going to do today is to outline the major themes that emerge from my book, and then offer some reflections about what may lie ahead for these lands. These major themes demolish some common fictions that have grown up about these lands. The first and perhaps most notorious myth is that the public lands have generally been a divisive force in American life. In fact, the opposite is true. Slide, please. From the nation's very beginnings, the public lands have tended to unite rather than divide us. As illustrated on this slide, here's the first example with which I opened the book. It opens with a story of a bitter dispute that for years thwarted the very formation of the United States government, the first national government, after the 13 colonies declared their independence from Great Britain. It erupted between colonies like Virginia and New York that had extensive claims to so-called Western lands, these lands west of the crest of the Appalachians. Between them and colonies like Maryland and New Jersey that had fixed Western boundaries and lacked such claims. The states with the claims were going to dominate the states that did not have the claims. And so the states without the claims said, we're not going to join the government until you agree to cede them to the national government. And eventually a deal was struck. It took years to negotiate, but the new national government took control of those Western lands. And the deal was it should use them to keep the nation together. Close slide, please. Those were the nation's first public lands, and the national government proceeded to use them, and others it acquired from foreign governments and Native Americans to do just that, to build and hold the nation together as Euro-American settlements swept across the continent and new states were admitted to the Union. Gifts of public lands were, for example, instrumental in creating a system of public education in every state, including higher education, and in building infrastructure like canals and railroads. Now, a second example I give of how the public lands helped unify the nation came in the 1880s, when railroad and mining interests sought to dismember the national park at Yellowstone. In the face of this threat, two former Civil War adversaries, a Union Army general and a former Confederate official who had become a US Senator, joined forces to preserve the park intact for all to enjoy. Now, the second myth that emerges is that the public lands tend to divide Americans along partisan lines. That is a myth. Today, we tend to view all issues of public policy through a kind of a red-blue Republican-Democrat lens. But as my book shows, a dominant, recurring theme throughout public land history is how the vast majority of people, Republicans and Democrats alike, have agreed on the importance of holding more and more lands in US ownership and protecting them so that all may have opportunities for life-changing encounters with nature and can learn from and be inspired by their rich cultural and scientific resources. My book provides many examples of how this cause transcended political parties. The stellar contributions of the two presidents, Roosevelt, Theodore, a Republican, and Franklin, a Democrat, are pretty well known. But my book brings deserved attention to many less than household names from both parties who played important roles in this story. To cite just one, few have ever heard of Fred Seaton. He was a Republican senator from Kansas. And then Dwight Eisenhower named him to be Interior Secretary in the late 1950s. Once there, he acted to put more than 11 million acres of public lands in Alaska into vast national wildlife refuges, most notably the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The third myth is that these decisions to hold and protect more lands have been mostly a land grab by the national government, carried out over local and state opposition. This claim was on full display here in Oregon in 2016, when armed extremists took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge a couple hundred miles east of here for several days, claiming they were, quote, taking the lands back. That claim was simply delusional. Those are not my words, by the way. They're the words of a Nevada state judge who was hearing a case brought by the Bundys down in Nevada. The US had purchased the lands in the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in the 1930s, paying cash to a very willing seller, a corporation that was operating a failing agricultural enterprise there. In fact, as my book shows, petitions from the grassroots played a key role in the establishment of nearly all of the protected public lands we see today. Slide, please. Crater Lake, about 100 miles southeast of here, shown here, is an excellent example of how different the reality was from those fictions I just described. The process to protect Crater Lake began in 1885, as concern was growing that powerful entities like railroads might try to gain ownership of it under several divestment laws then in place. To head it off, Oregon's Republican governor, its state legislature, and its representatives in Congress, also Republicans, petitioned Congress to protect the area. President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, acted in early 1886 to preserve Congress's options by withdrawing 230,000 acres of public land surrounding Crater Lake from the operation of these divestment laws. Then in 1893, 2 years after Congress gave presidents broad authority to safeguard public lands and so-called forest reserves, Cleveland included the Crater Lake area in the 5 million acre Cascade Range Forest Reserve he established. Some of it's shown in green on that map surrounding Crater Lake. Finally, in 1902, Congress established Crater Lake National Park. Close slide, please. As my book recounts, stories like this were repeated over and over again in many places around the country. Now, occasionally there were little hiccups in this process. One involved a one-term senator from Oregon named Charles Fulton. In March 1907, claiming that Theodore Roosevelt was threatening to use his forest reserve authority to lock up land suitable for farming, Fulton attached a rider to an agricultural appropriation bill that forbade the president from putting any additional public lands into forest reserves in 6 western states, including Oregon, without Congress's approval. Fulton's rider, by the way, left existing reserves in those states undisturbed. Before Roosevelt signed that bill into law, he signed proclamations putting 16 million more acres of public lands into forest reserves in the 6 states named in Fulton's rider. In taking this seemingly bold step, Roosevelt was making a shrewd political calculation. As he himself had earlier told Congress, quote, "The forest reserve policy can be successful only when it has the full support of the people of the West, because people who live in the neighborhood of these reserves will ultimately determine whether or not they are to be permanent." As my book recounts, Roosevelt's political instincts were, as usual, excellent. Neither these new reserves nor the many more reserves he established in other states in his remaining time in office caused any genuine uproar or inside or outside of Congress. No serious effort was ever made to undo them. Indeed, far from setting back the cause of safeguarding lands and national ownership, the events in that early 1907 period significantly advanced that cause. Another part of that same legislation paved the way for extending the idea of forest reserves across the nation, because it ordered the Agriculture Department to study and recommend whether the US ought to acquire lands to establish new forest reserves in New England and the Southeast. And 4 years later, 1911, Congress launched a program that eventually resulted in the purchase of more than 20 million acres and the establishment of 52 national forests in more than 24 states in the East, South, and Midwest. It was therefore entirely fitting that the same 1907 legislation that had the Fulton Rider decreed that forest reserves, quote, shall hereafter be known as national forests. Slide, please. In fact, most of the public lands now found, next slide, please. Most of the public lands that you see on the East, Southeast, Midwest, Upper Midwest, etc., they were acquired by the national government from willing seller private owners with the support of the relevant states. Indeed, most of the once private lands that form large national parks like the Everglades in South Florida and Big Bend over there in Texas were actually acquired by the states themselves, paid for by the state's taxpayers, and then donated to the United States so they could become national. My book also sets the facts straight on another commonly misunderstood public land story, namely how in the early 1930s, the United States decided to keep some 150 million acres of so-called unreserved public lands, and those are the ones in the sort of light orange there, mostly in the Great Basin. How the United States decided to keep them in national ownership. Most of those lands had been grazed for many decades by domestic livestock with the passive acquiescence of the government, but Dust Bowl conditions had plunged the industry into deep depression. President Hoover proposed to give all these lands to the states on certain conditions. Congress responded by calling for a committee known as the Garfield Committee, after its chair, to consider Hoover's idea. Most of its 20 members were Republicans from the West. The committee recommended, with no dissents, that this vast acreage be put under what it called, quote, responsible administration or regulation for the conservation and beneficial use of its resources, and that the states be given the option to accept that responsibility. Importantly, however, the Garfield Committee recommended that before that offer was to be extended to the states, the US should reserve in national ownership all of those public lands deemed important for national forests, national parks, national monuments, and migratory bird refuges. The committee emphasized the importance of protecting, quote, wilderness, wildlife, archaeological and ethnological remains, and unusual wonders of nature. Only then would the remaining public lands be offered to the states, and only with significant strings attached, including that states would have a trust responsibility to rehabilitate those lands. Now, neither the states nor the major interest groups could agree on how to respond, and legislation to carry out the committee's recommendations went nowhere. At this point, veteran Congressman Edward Taylor of Colorado, a Democrat, building on a proposal crafted in the preceding Congress by a Utah Republican named Don Colton, introduced legislation requiring the United States to control livestock grazing on those lands, to rehabilitate them and stabilize the floundering livestock industry that depended on them. Enacted with strong bipartisan support, the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 assigned this task to the Interior Department, which eventually in 1946 established the Bureau of Land Management to carry forward its implementation. This episode had another important but little noticed effect. It brought attention to the fact that these previously unreserved lands here in orange contain many places worthy of special protection. Popular interest in protecting natural scenery, recreational opportunities, wildlife habitat, etc., had not slackened in the Great Depression, and over succeeding decades, as appreciation of their values grew, the US would put many millions more of these acres in protected status that carry names like, in Oregon, Hart Mountain, Steens Mountain, and Cascade Siskiyou, and elsewhere, names like Arches, Bears Ears, Chiricahua, Grand Staircase Escalante, Joshua Tree, Missouri Breaks, Oregon Pipe Cactus, Rio Grande del Norte. Close slide, please. Now, there's a fourth myth about public land history, namely that most decisions to conserve lands in US ownership have been made by executive fiat, by people like Theodore Roosevelt, over the opposition of many in Congress. The facts are mostly otherwise. For as my book shows, Congress not only gave the executive that power in the first place, but almost always subsequently approved how the executive exercised it. Indeed, in the 1960s, Congress began reclaiming from the executive primary authority to decide what kinds of uses ought to be allowed on particular tracts of public land. This movement was led by a conservative Democrat from Colorado's Western Slope named Wayne Aspinall. His first big success was in the Wilderness Act of 1964. There, Congress created a very new protective category of federal lands, providing detailed instructions regarding what was permitted and what was not. Lands given wilderness designation were generally to remain free not only from extractive activities like logging and mining, but also from roads and motorized vehicles. Now, Aspinall personally did not favor limiting intensive industrial uses of the public lands, but more important to him was that Congress should make those basic decisions. And so he insisted that Congress be the gatekeeper of the wilderness system. That has had a significant, if not very well appreciated, effect on public land policy. Namely, it's enhanced the influence of individual senators and House members who represent particular areas rich with public lands. This is because there's a powerful, long-standing custom in the Congress that gives members an effective veto over legislation that applies particularly to their states or districts. Aspinall seriously underestimated the support that would develop at the grassroots for limiting such industrial uses. In fact, Congress has enacted many dozens of individual pieces of legislation that have together put more than 100 million acres, almost a fifth of the public land area, into the National Wilderness Preservation System. Beginning around the same time in the mid-1960s, Congress enacted numerous other laws that zoned or circumscribed what uses would be permitted on particular areas of public land. Many such areas carry labels like National Recreation Area, National Conservation Area, National Preserve. Each comes with statutory management specifications that have much the same effect as the Wilderness Act, if somewhat less strict and a little more variable. They all make conservation and recreation the primary objectives of management. And they limit agency discretion by ruling out or strongly discouraging road building, mining, timber harvesting, and the like. Besides adding protections, they bring more visibility to areas' natural and cultural qualities. Next slide, please. Oregon provides an excellent demonstration of this congressional zoning. You can see all the colored areas here with the key. Congress established the first national recreation area in 1964. Among the early ones were the Oregon Dunes over on the coast and Hell's Canyon on the opposite end along the Idaho-Oregon border. There are now more than 36 national recreation areas, including Mount Hood National Recreation Area in the nation. Congress established the first national conservation area in 1970. There are now 17. Congress established the first 2 national preserves in 1974 in Texas and South Florida. There are now nearly 24. Beginning in the 1960s, Congress established nearly a dozen national seashores and national lake shores, and it's established national scenic areas like the Columbia River Gorge. And sometimes Congress has fashioned unique labels, like the 420,000 acre Steens Mountain Cooperative Management and Protection Area in Eastern Oregon. That's a mouthful, but there's no mistaking Congress's essentially protective purpose in designating that area. Then there's the National Wild and Scenic River System. Next slide, please. Congress established it in 1968 on the Wilderness Act model, Congress being the gatekeeper. In fact, Oregon has more miles of river corridors in this national system than any other state, thanks primarily to Mark Hatfield, a Republican who represented Oregon in the US Senate for 30 years after serving 2 terms as state governor. In doing all this, Congress did not discriminate among the four principal land management agencies. Thus today, the BLM, the Forest, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Park Service, and the Forest Service each looks after millions of acres in the wilderness system and numerous wild and scenic river segments, and 3 of the 4 manage national recreation areas, and on and on. Congress also asserted its authority in a more generic way by enacting new management charters, or so-called organic acts, for all of the 4 agencies. BLM and the Forest Service got new organic acts in 1976. The Fish and Wildlife Service got one in 1997, Park Service in 1998. In each of these acts, Congress provided more specificity in management objectives, a more detailed process for making decisions, and clear marching orders to pay close attention to science and environmental protection. In doing all this, Congress has substantially blurred distinctions among the 4 agencies. And this in turn has elevated in public consciousness the idea that regardless of which agency is in charge, public lands are generally managed for open space conservation and recreation more than anything else. Next slide, please. Congress's reclaiming of authority over public lands has also enhanced the durability of these protections. As this slide plainly shows, the arc of public land management has consistently bent toward protecting more and more land. And once protections of public lands are installed, it is almost unheard of for Congress to weaken or rescind those protections. The new Organic Act for the Bureau of Land Management, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, which is commonly, if inelegantly, called FLPMA, deserves particular mention. It put into law nearly all of the recommendations of the congressionally established Public Land Law Review Commission. The PLLRC was a bipartisan blue ribbon body dominated by Westerners and chaired by none other than Wayne Aspinall. The Congressional Conference Committee that turned its recommendations into FLPMA was likewise dominated by Western members of the House and the Senate. FLPMA's broad thrust was a call for greener management of BLM managed public lands, which contain more acres than any other system. One of the most important developments in public land policy in the last half century, as my book puts it, is how the BLM, long derided as the Bureau of Livestock and Mining, has, with the strong bipartisan encouragement of the US Congress, made conservation, protection of cultural resources, and recreation a major focus of its management. Next slide, please. This is neatly captured in the change in the BLM's logo. On the left, pre-64, a miner, logger, rancher, engineer, and surveyor looking out on an industrial landscape. On the right, post-64, mountains, meadows, river, and tree. Close slide, please. It's important to note also that while the Democrats controlled Congress in the 1960s and 1970s, Republicans like John Saylor of Pennsylvania played key roles in crafting many pieces of public lands legislation. And these generally passed with strong bipartisan support. Indeed, the final votes were usually nearly unanimous. Moreover, Republican presidents Nixon and Ford were generally as supportive as their Democratic counterparts. Close slide, please. Ronald Reagan's rise in the late 1970s marked a growing polarization of the body politic on many important issues, but it did not, my book makes clear, significantly affect the overall direction of public land policy. It was during this time that the so-called Sagebrush Rebellion erupted. It was promoted primarily by federal grazing permittees unhappy with the direction of federal policy. And it took the form of legislation adopted by a handful of Western states that formally claimed state ownership of BLM lands. The claim was a stunt. It was not a serious political movement aimed at divesting the US of ownership. And the so-called rebellion quickly fizzled. The states that enacted that legislation never tried to litigate their claim in court or take any other concrete steps to enforce it. Congress never took it seriously, and neither did the executive branch or the American people, including the people in the very states that were ostensibly rebelling. Underneath this blast of hot air, the long tradition of bipartisan consensus supporting more protection for more public lands endured. That bipartisan consensus easily survived a hiccup when, early in his first term, libertarian economists talked President Reagan into proposing the sale of some 35 million acres of so-called surplus federal land to help balance the federal budget. The idea triggered much grassroots opposition and found no support among Republicans or Democrats in Congress. Around the same time, Reagan's first Interior Secretary, James Watt, sought to issue oil and gas leases off every coast and in wilderness areas on shore. The Wilderness Act of '64 had created a 20-year window for leasing in wilderness areas, and it was about to close. Watt's proposals were quickly beaten back by a strong bipartisan coalition in the affected states and in Congress. After Watt became a serious political liability and left office, Reagan, a masterful politician, moved swiftly to the middle on public lands issues, working with Congress to follow the well-worn path to protect more public lands. Next slide, please. In 1984, with the Senate in Republican control, Reagan signed legislation adding more than 8 million acres to the National Wilderness System, the largest addition in any single year since the Wilderness Act was enacted in '64, except for the special case Alaska, which is a steep curve in 1980. Indeed, before he left office, Reagan signed legislation putting more acreage in the lower 48 states into the wilderness system than any president before or since. That arc, always going upward, more and more protection. Next slide, please. The pattern held through subsequent administrations. For example, although the contract with America that Newt Gingrich used in leading a Republican takeover of the House of Representatives in 1994 bristled with anti-government rhetoric, it was utterly silent on public lands. The contract's principal drafter, Republican messaging guru Frank Luntz, put the matter bluntly in a later memo. He advised the GOP to avoid making a head-on challenge to what he called, quote, the most popular federal programs today, namely conservation of public lands and waters through parks and open spaces. Much the same thing happened when the so-called Tea Party insurgency led to Republican capture of control of the House in 2010. Although Republican platforms in the last couple of decades have sometimes included planks calling for divesting public lands, kind of a dog whistle to the far right fringe of the party, no serious effort has ever been made to put those planks in practice. This chart tells a story. Congress has continued to enact bipartisan legislation, adding more and more protections to public lands. That dotted line is going up and up, always up. In early 2009, for example, President Obama signed the Omnibus Public Land Management Act into law. Among other things, it put millions more acres in the wilderness system, established 4 new national conservation areas, and added 3 new units to the national park system. Most of its parts had been assembled earlier when the Republicans controlled the White House and one House of Congress. Now, what about the Trump administration, you might ask? Certainly, it made numerous efforts to bend public land policy away from conservation and toward industrial exploitation. For one thing, as I'll discuss in a moment, it sought to turn as many public lands over to the fossil fuel industry as it could. Next slide, please. But its biggest splash on public lands was to severely shrink the size of 2 large national monuments, the Grand Staircase Escalante and the Bears Ears, that Presidents Clinton and Obama had established on more than 3 million acres of public lands in southern Utah. But do not be fooled by this headline-grabbing action. It did not reflect a change in public opinion, and it did not significantly alter the pattern of congressional legislation. Indeed, before he left office, close slide, please. Before he left office, President Trump himself signed 2 major bipartisan public land protection pieces of legislation into law. The first, in 2019, was another omnibus bill with many parts. It put another 1 million acres in the National Wilderness System. It expanded several National Park System units. It withdrew several 100,000 acres of public lands near 2 national parks and mining. Its most noteworthy piece added protections to nearly 1 million acres of public land in southern Utah, crafted by the all-Republican Utah congressional delegation not long after Trump severely downsized the nearby Bears Ears National Monument. Another component of that 2019 bill cemented into federal law the Land and Water Conservation Fund that Congress established in 1964. That fund provides a stream of money derived primarily from oil and gas leases offshore and onshore for federal, state, and local government agencies to buy more land for conservation and recreation. Congress had previously required the fund to be renewed periodically, but now in 2019, it made the fund permanent. The next year, Trump signed into law the Great American Outdoors Act, which has been called the biggest public lands conservation legislation in a generation, primarily because it made a fundamental change in the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Before, Congress had insisted that each year it got to decide how much money ought to be spent out of that fund. The result was that between 1965 and 2019, less than half of the more than $40 billion accruing to the fund had been dispersed. With strong bipartisan support, Congress in 2020 made it a true revolving fund, permitting its revenues to be spent as they are accrued. This was a major victory for public lands everywhere. Now, as most of you no doubt know, last fall, President Biden reversed the Trump action on the Utah monuments. At Bears Ears, by the way, a majority of the newly elected local county commissioners endorsed Biden's action. Biden also restored, or is working to restore, many other public lands protections that Trump sought to undo or weaken. So far, he's not encountered a great deal of pushback despite the Democrats' very thin margins in the Congress. Now, Americans have long argued about the role the national government should play in American life. But my book makes the case that for more than a century, the public lands have been a consistent exception to that pattern. Of course, as is true of just about any issue where there's a broad consensus that supports action by the national government, one can find a small, if sometimes noisy, group of dissenters, people who are hostile to just about everything the government does on public lands. But according to practically every opinion poll taken over the last many years, in the West, as well as in the rest of the nation, large majorities of Americans across both political parties want more and better protected public lands to provide more open space and recreational opportunities and protect watersheds and wildlife and cultural resources. Put another way, because the public lands today reflect the vast majority of what the American people have sought, the result can fairly be regarded as a political success story, showing the political process working as it's supposed to work, where Congress responds to and accurately reflects public opinion. Bringing more attention to success stories like this is particularly important in our polarized era, where many are skeptical that anything good can come out of the nation's capital. It was a major reason why I wrote the book. This is not creeping socialism. Everyone who lives in areas with abundant public lands knows that they provide many opportunities for private enterprise and employment. The continuing emphasis on protecting public lands illustrates how tourism and recreation-dependent businesses have become a major economic driver in many smaller communities in the West, as well as elsewhere, making the economic contributions of traditional activities like mining and logging and livestock grazing pale by comparison. Now, let me pivot to look forward. Slide, please. Although the public lands are a major political success story, they face major challenges. The biggest ones, obviously, are the interrelated ones of climate change and biodiversity loss. While both are global problems, both pose countless tests for public lands. A changing climate alters the natural qualities of public lands that are usually a major reason why the United States decided to retain or acquire them in the first place. Your children's Yellowstone, the headline of an article in the New York Times not long ago warned, will be radically different. Public lands contain important reservoirs of biodiversity, much of it threatened by what is now being called the sixth great extinction in the planet's history. It's no surprise that a substantial proportion of species listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act depend upon habitat found on public lands. I believe the history of Americans' public lands, close slide please. I believe the history of American public lands can help inform how we as a society confront these challenges. For one thing, public lands furnish some vivid demonstrations of the effects of climate change and biodiversity loss that can help arouse public opinion and stimulate needed political action. As the earth warms, the glaciers are rapidly disappearing from Glacier National Park. The Joshua and Sequoia trees in the national parks named for them likely face a similar fate. Numerous national forests are suffering from bark beetle and other climate-related pest outbreaks. In many public lands-rich places, as well as elsewhere, droughts are becoming more frequent, more severe, and longer lasting, and large wildfires more intense. Florida's Everglades and numerous other protected areas of public land along the coasts, including nearly 1/3 of the nation's 550 national wildlife refuges, face inundation as the seas rise. Now, dealing effectively with these challenges requires, at the most fundamental level, a frank acknowledgement that society's collective interest must outweigh shorter-term, narrower interests. And America's public lands are, for the most part, a great example of our political system deciding to do exactly that. Indeed, one could argue that the public lands represent some of the best thinking for the future the American political system has ever produced. This suggests that the public lands can help lead the way in the necessary transition to decarbonize the world's economy. Recall this wise aphorism: the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stones, but because humanity found better ways to meet its needs. In the same way, our dependence on fossil fuels for energy will not end because we run out of fossil fuels, but because we take action realizing that ending that dependency is likely the only way humanity will avert catastrophe. The public lands are already involved in that transition. Indeed, the Trump administration provided a dramatic illustration of it. In 2017, it pushed through Congress on a strict party line vote, legislation that the state of Alaska and big oil companies had been promoting for a half-century, to auction off oil and gas leases on public lands in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. But when, in one of its last acts in January 2021, the Trump administration held a lease sale there, the result was a giant bust. Most tracts offered didn't get any bids. Total amount of bids among all the tracts was $14 million, not several hundred million or billions that had been forecast. Major oil companies stayed away, in part because development costs were high and because of public pressure. It's no small irony, by the way, that one reason for the high cost is rapidly melting permafrost, which makes installing the needed infrastructure for such development much more expensive. In many other places on public lands, both onshore and offshore, Trump administration efforts to promote more fossil fuel development have been thwarted by bipartisan opposition and declining industry interests. Next slide, please. Now, public lands will also facilitate the transition away from, next slide, will facilitate the transition away from fossil fuels by furnishing sites for wind and solar energy. And here's a recent example. In stark contrast to the auction bust in the Arctic Refuge, an auction of leases 10 days ago to produce wind energy off the coast of Long Island, New York, attracted more than $4 billion in bids. Close slide. Now, regarding loss of biodiversity, my book contains numerous examples of how the public lands have been used historically to stem that loss. Indeed, a long-standing goal of public land policy has been to restore biodiversity and environmental health. In 1911, for example, the Weeks Act that Congress enacted, with strong bipartisan support, launched a program of buying up lands in the upper reaches of the eastern, southern, and midwestern watersheds, many of which had been logged over, in order to restore forests, reduce erosion, and help prevent destructive floods. The legislation was strongly supported by Democratic governors from the South and Republican governors from the North, one of whom noted that it was the first time in American history that governors from those two regions had appeared jointly before Congress, quote, to ask for something for the common welfare of the United States. My book also describes how in the depths of the Great Depression, the government began a major program concentrated in the middle of the country to acquire prime wildlife habitat to reverse a sharp decline in the population of migratory birds. A key mechanism for funding the purchases, one supported by sport hunters, was the sale of so-called duck stamps. The resulting acquisition of more lands into public ownership worked to reverse the bird decline. In fact, public lands today comprise the great bulk of the 12% of US lands overall and the 26% of US marine areas, whose biodiversity is now generally considered protected. They are thus playing a prominent role in the Biden administration's so-called America the Beautiful program, which aims at conserving 30% of the nation's lands and waters by 2030. Nearly all of the world's nations, by the way, have endorsed that goal. It's fitting that the public lands play a primary role in this effort, for their protection has long made the United States a world leader in safeguarding large tracts of land for conservation and related needs. Global networks of protected lands include biosphere reserves. There are more than 700 across 120 nations, including a dozen in the United States, all on public lands. World heritage sites that celebrate nature, now more than 200 in nearly 100 nations, including 20 in the United States, mostly on public lands. And wetlands of international importance, now numbering well over 2,000 in more than 150 nations, including 40 in the United States that are by acreage nearly all on public lands. Now let me briefly address another major challenge the public lands face. Next slide, the so-called recreational explosion. Keeping in mind that to recreate means to restore or recover, it's unsurprising that many Americans turned to their public lands for relief and solace during the pandemic. In 1 month last year, more than 1 million people swarmed Yellowstone. That never happened before. Zion National Park and numerous other iconic places smashed previous visitation records. It's a good thing people want to recreate on public lands. That opportunity needs to be safeguarded for all, regardless of their bank balances. But it can be challenging to manage large numbers of recreational users while preserving meaningful visitor experiences and not loving the lands to death, destroying the very qualities that attract visitors. Increasing visitation stresses not only lands, but infrastructure and the personnel and budgets of the managing agencies and poses new challenges. Today, rather than wrestling with questions regarding logging or mining, public land managers are much more likely to be struggling to balance recreational use with protection of wildlife and cultural resources, and wrestling with whether and how to accommodate bikers and off-road vehicle users and e-bikers and bird watchers and wild horse lovers and target shooters and sport hunters and anglers and climbers and myriad other enthusiasts. Now, there's good news on this front. Close slide, by the way. The Great American Outdoors Act that Congress enacted in 2020 with strong bipartisan support took a major step to address the maintenance backlog of the 4 major public land agencies. The Legacy Restoration Fund it established for that purpose has been called the largest single investment in public lands in American history. Now, before closing, let me say a few words about President Biden's naming of Deb Haaland, a member of Congress from New Mexico, to be Interior Secretary, the first Native American to hold a cabinet post in US history. And as you probably know, he also named Chuck Sams, a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in northeastern Oregon, to head the National Park Service. And I'm delighted in an inspired choice, he named my good friend Bob Anderson from the Wafort Band of Chippewa in Minnesota to have my old job, the Solicitor of the Interior Department. My book, as I said, explores in some detail how, starting in the decades after World War II, Indian nations have increasingly demanded and often succeeded in winning greater consideration of their strong connections to their ancestral lands that are now in public ownership. For example, they've worked with Congress and the executive with some success to safeguard cultural sites. In a few places, historical injustices have been corrected by conveying lands of special cultural significance back to tribes. President Obama broke new ground by creating a special intertribal commission to advise the Interior Secretary on the management of the Bears Ears National Monument. And the US is also, along with many other nations around the world, looking to draw more on the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples for guidance in protecting biodiversity and dealing with the challenges of climate change. For example, by using fire as a management tool and working to restore salmon runs. The nation's public lands offer many opportunities for redressing past injustices and healing societal wounds. In general, Native nations and peoples strongly support protecting and restoring public land areas and values that are of particular cultural and spiritual significance to them. And I'm confident Secretary Holland and her team will make important contributions in this area. In closing, let me underscore that the political process ultimately sets public land policy. The American people have the final word. This means the future of these lands may be determined largely by how Americans, and especially the rising generation, like most of you, react to the changes now underway. For public lands to have a bright future, younger, more diverse generations of people from all walks of life need to engage with them and with the political system. Good policy doesn't just happen. It comes about because people advocate for it. Mechanism for engaging that has gained considerable favor is what has been called friends groups, nonprofit organizations that advocate for particular landscapes, usually working closely with government managers. They offer an important way for people to get more involved in their public lands. The questions that loom are daunting. Will future voters support continuing to protect public lands as a changing climate takes its toll, as biodiversity suffers, as more and more iconic places become crowded? What if rejecting rather than respecting the teachings of science becomes a dominant attitude? If partisan rhetoric intensifies and the American political system becomes more dysfunctional? Will candidates for public office, especially in places where public lands are abundant, continue to believe that protecting these lands enhances the quality of life? Depending upon how these questions are answered, the long-standing bipartisan consensus on the general direction of public land policy will either endure or unravel. Although many are quick to conclude that politics never produces good results, a principal theme of my book is, as I said, that public lands are a political success story. Most Americans today agree that holding and protecting large amounts of land and national ownership open to all has been extraordinarily visionary and beneficial. For all its imperfections, in other words, the American political system has bridged political party, regional, and other divisions to produce a result that most Americans today strongly support. As President Richard Nixon put it in 1971, the public lands are the nation's breathing space, a vast public asset that nurtures national pride, physical and mental health, and a spirit of community in an increasingly diverse nation. These lands have offered tens of millions of people life-changing encounters with nature, and public lands-related tourism has become the economic anchor of many communities. And public land policy has also begun, admittedly tardily, to better reflect the diversity of our society and to acknowledge past injustices. Because these lands remain subject to the will of the elected, a group defined more broadly than ever before, they can play a part in redressing some of the injustices of the past and provide one more opportunity to demonstrate our ability as a people to work together to find common ground. In his seminal work, The Wealth of Nations, published the same year of the Declaration of Independence, the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, the champion of free market capitalism, made a strong case for private ownership of land, but for a single exception. A great and civilized nation, he wrote, ought to own and hold lands, quote, for the purposes of pleasure and magnificence for everyone's benefit. That the national government, responding to public opinion, has heeded Smith's advice is, as my book documents in much detail, a bipartisan success story deserving of celebration, a welcome counter to the political polarization and distrust that currently plagues us. Thanks very much for watching and listening, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much for that address. It looks like we do have a few questions in the chat, so I'll just start with the first one. How can the Bureau of Land Management continue to manage the ONC lands with harvest targets that essentially come from the 1937 ONC Act in the face of climate change and ESA or Endangered Species Act concerns?
There's a knowledgeable questioner. The ONC Act is an interesting piece of legislation. For its time, it was considered very progressive. because it called for so-called multiple use of lands at a time when multiple use wasn't the catchword. But it also specified in there that the ONC lands shall be managed for commercial forest production, I think is the exact words of the statute. And that's created a tension that has been grappled with ever since. What does that exactly mean? And does that mean logging is the primary purpose or the first purpose among equals or among many, or is it just one of many purposes? There's been some litigation about that. It's never been conclusively resolved. And frankly, I think Congress ought to take a look at it. But the Bureau of Land Management does struggle and has struggled with the idea of how much emphasis to give to commercial forest production. And that's an area that actually Congress ought to look at. And but it'll take a heavy political lift, probably.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question from Gabby. It says, can you touch on the merits of linking LWCF funding to oil and gas leases? Is there any concern that this linkage might be indirectly incentivizing further oil and gas drilling in connection with the public lands conservation?
Also an excellent question, because you're exactly right. The Land and Water Conservation Fund, which produces billions of dollars for public land conservation, is tied to oil and gas revenues. Does that provide an incentive? Well, yes and no. Yes, it does provide, I suppose, a faint incentive, but most of the incentive actually comes from particularly the coastal states of Louisiana and Texas, because it's off there in the Gulf of Mexico that most of the revenues are produced for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So I would say, yes, it is a factor, an incentive factor, but only a slight incentive factor, I would say, politically overall. And over time, I would hope we would find other alternative sources besides fossil fuels to produce this revenue, because everybody agrees that the idea of the fund and acquiring and protecting more land is a good idea.
Next, we have a question from Charles, and it says, if there was a technology that could permanently and economically remove carbon from the atmosphere, do you think using public lands for this purpose would be wise?
Well, we don't have the technology yet to do that at scale. So until we develop that technology, I think it's premature to sort of say this is a good thing or a bad thing for the public land. If you capture it, where do you store it? Most people are talking about deep geologic storage. I'm not a scientist. I don't know how safe and secure that is. That's obviously a question. Carbon capture technology could be a game changer, but lots of people, including me, are sort of skeptical whether it could ever be developed at the scale that is needed. And we can't, frankly, wait. I think most scientists would say we can't wait, 10, 15 years to see if it's going to be developed. We need to move away now. Start moving in a serious way now away from it.
Now, Peter asks, you talk about climate change as a dire threat and how public lands are playing an important role in the face of climate change. You also talk about how the Stone Age ended because we put down the stones and found better tools. Isn't it time that we ban leasing and development of fossil fuels on public lands, full stop?
Well, this is something obviously the Biden administration's grappling with as we speak. And it's a big challenge in this sense. There are jobs dependent upon their existing oil economy that has jobs and all of that, that has to be taken into account. There is no doubt that the amount of leasing is going down and will continue to go down. But there are an awful lot of leases out there. Oil and gas production is not going to end on federal lands tomorrow. It's not a switch you can turn off and on and off. I think the general trajectory is good. Are we moving fast enough? Probably not. But those numbers I gave you of the Arctic sail versus the wind sail off Long Island, it's pretty telling about where the overall economy and investment wants to go. So I'm optimistic. Are we moving as fast as we could be? Probably not. But there's a political process here we have to reckon with. And the Biden administration has a very narrow margin in Congress, and so it doesn't have the freedom that it might otherwise have if it had bigger majority. So we've all heard about Joe Manchin in West Virginia, right? So that's part of the problem.
So another question from Rob Smith that says, do the Bundys represent the start of a major revolution in public land control, or is it just another bump in the road on the history of federal land retention and management? And why do guys with cowboy hats get away with this sort of domestic criminal activity?
I wonder if that's my old friend Rob Smith, who used to live in Arizona where I lived. And anyway, if that's you, Rob, hi. I think the Bundys are not even a hiccup, frankly. You know, as I said, a state court judge looked at their claims and called them utterly delusional. That was a Nevada state court judge, by the way. They have no political fault. They have no legal claim. They have no, I don't think they have a political claim. They are very, very fringe. There is not anybody or anything more than a handful of people in the Congress who would pay any attention to the idea that we should sell off or get rid of significant amounts of public lands. It's just not there. I mean, I'll give you one example, very concrete example. The Republican Party platform the last 20 years or so has occasionally had a plank in it that's a kind of a dog whistle to the right wing, that says we should study whether or not we should cede control of public lands to the states or get rid of some public lands. When that came up in 2016, there was a congressman from Montana named Ryan Zinke who was on the platform committee, and he saw the committee seriously consider that platform, and he resigned in protest. He said, we don't want to do this. This is a crazy idea. I'm walking out. So he walks out. Donald Trump Jr. sees that and goes, wow, this is a great guy. Let's make him Secretary of the Interior. And he became Secretary of the Interior. So that kind of tells you where the politics are on this. I am not worried about the Bundys starting a political movement that is going to have any legs. I just don't think it is realistic.
So our next question comes from Carolyn, and it says, what is your opinion on current cattle grazing practices on public lands, especially in light of the fact that the massive numbers of cattle raised to be slaughtered in this country are consuming large amounts of water and resources, including plants that could feed wildlife?
Excellent question. I've done a lot with grazing over the years in my career in public lands. I think we are probably approaching a Dust Bowl kind of scenario, a repeat of the Dust Bowl of the late 20s and early 30s, which really drastically changed federal grazing policy from on public lands, from no policy at all, just acquiescence, to the Taylor Grazing Act, which for all its flaws did start a system of regulating and restricting and trying to rehabilitate some of these lands. I think we may be at a similar crossroads now, because as the questioner said quite correctly, it's not only their effect on the public lands grasses. The industry is in big trouble because their primary feed other than public lands grass is alfalfa grown with irrigated agriculture, which is the largest consumer of water in the Colorado River Basin. And so as the Colorado River Basin dries up or diminishes, alfalfa, being a very low value crop, is the first to go. Urban uses and higher value crops are going to take that, which means I think the livestock grazing industry in the Intermountain West is in big trouble for reasons that have nothing to do with government regulation. It's just economics and the reality of climate change. Now, here's an interesting point. I think one way out, by the way, I should also say, because this caught my eye the other day, people tend to think of public lands grazers as, the guys with the cowboy hats, as Rob Smith said, and cowboy boots, and, the 9 generations of ranchers and blah, blah, blah. Guess who bought a 200,000 acre ranch in Montana a couple of weeks ago? From the Koch brothers, by the way. Rupert Murdoch, the media magnate. He's a public land rancher, okay? It's been estimated that probably half of the ranchers' livestock permittees on public lands are so-called amenity ranchers. That is, they're in it for the lifestyle. They're not in it to make a living. They make their money somewhere else. That has to be factored into this. One final point on ranching. a good solution that has emerged in many parts of the West is for ranchers to be bought out voluntarily, that is willingly sell to conservation interests who then have the public managing agencies retire the land from grazing. That's a win-win for everybody. A rancher who doesn't want to ranch anymore gets money to walk away with, and the public lands get helped and conserved. There's a big problem doing that, however. The government can't make a permanent retirement without Congress's approval. And when you seek legislation to do that, the Public Lands Council, which is the trade association of public lands ranchers, vigorously opposes it and makes it very hard to do that. We need legislation to make voluntary retirements more feasible. There is legislation pending. It's been kicked around for the last few years. That would have an enormous effect, I think, because there would be a lot of money available from public and philanthropic sources to buy up and retire some of these really contested pastures, which often are, very difficult to graze in anyway. So that is a potential solution. I talk about that a little bit at the end of my book because I think it's a very promising solution.
So I think we only have time for one or two more questions because we're almost out. And I do want to remind everyone that if you're interested in buying Professor Leshy's book, there is a link in the Q&A chat that sends you to the Yale Publishers website where you can order it. But the next question is, given that climate change is damaging and threatening our public lands, what are your thoughts on the constitutional rights of young people to the perpetuity of our public lands and the government's role as a public trustee? I assume this is probably referring to the Juliana case.
I expect so. And, I mean, as you know much better than me, University of Oregon Law School has been kind of the nerve center for that kind of argument. To be honest with you, I'm familiar with the argument. I've looked at it. I know it's had a kind of a uncertain hearing in the courts. I'm agnostic. I don't know. I would say this, at the federal level, I think it's unlikely that it will get traction in the federal courts because we have a very conservative Supreme Court. We're going to see this year how conservative that court is. And I think people are going to generally be shocked at how conservative it is, how kind of anti-regulatory it is. They have this big climate change case now that most people involved in this field are very nervous about. So I think at the federal court level, that is a extremely uphill battle. At the state court level, I think there's much, it may vary from state to state, but I think there's much better chance.
So I think this is unfortunately going to have to be our last question because we're running up on time. So Mr. Leshy, thank you so much for your address. What do you think of increasing calls for the land back movement, not just soliciting feedback from Indigenous tribes in management decision, but giving full management of currently government-owned lands back to those tribes?
It's a very, very complex question for lots of reasons. I think, as my book talks about, there are some examples where that has happened in very specific local situations after much negotiation. So I don't rule it out from happening more, but as a mass movement, I think it's extremely unlikely. In part because I'm not, I think it's complicated because often a piece of public lands has many different tribes interested in it, and sort of figuring out, how to balance those different interests is very complicated. So I think we'll see more of it as I describe in one of the chapters in my book, but I don't think it's going to, I'll be surprised if it turns into a kind of a mass movement. And thank you very much, Lisa, by the way, for handling the slideshow.
Oh yeah, no problem. So yeah, it looks like we're a couple minutes over time, so I think that we have to go, but thank you so much for your time and your presentation. And I look forward to reading your book soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Good luck.